Baltimore, 1994. A landlord is found dead in a locked room, 42 keys scattered across the floor like a confession. What begins as a single murder unravels into decades of secrets, disappearances, and lives he thought he owned. Detective Miles Harrington is called in from New York to untangle the case, only to discover that behind every door lies another ghost, and the truth is darker than anyone imagined. This is Miles Harrington, A House of Keys. A House of Keys. Chapter 1, Locked In. The room had the kind of quiet that pretends it's holy. Dust hovered like pale gnats in the wedge of streetlight, angling through the blind. An oscillating fan clicked its slow metronome against a pile of envelopes, stirring the stink. Mildew, cold coffee, a sweet iron whiff that clung low to the baseboards. The row house had the thin bones of a working man narrow, sunken, full of places to hide something you shouldn't own. He was in the bedroom, sitting on the floor against the bed frame as if he'd slid down it and forgotten to stand back up. Frank Dwyer, 48. Landlord to 36 units within 14 blocks. A man who wore short-sleeved dress shirts like a uniform, who had a laugh the tenant said was a little too loud, a little too rehearsed. His eyes were half open the way a doll's eyes get stuck. Purple marbling spread along his throat like bruised lace. The plastic dry-cleaning bag that had been cinched tight around his head lay slack in his lap, the twist tie still looped to one ear like a cheap earring. The windows were locked. The door was locked from the inside. The chain, too. The deadbolt had that slightly gummy feel of one that's been turned and turned, a nervous habit. There were 42 keys sprinkled across the wood floor, some flat and cheap, others old with ornate bowheads, each turned to a different angle, as if they'd been flung in a tantrum. They caught the light like fish bellies in shallow water. Captain Wallace leaned in the doorway and did what he always did when he needed to look thoughtful. He took off his hat and smoothed his hair as if he could iron the day into cooperating. He was softening at the middle, but the shoulders were still linebacker solid. His tie had a grease shimmer that made it look perpetually damp. "Locked room," said the crime scene tech kneeling by the jamb. "No tool marks, no prints on the knob except the deceased, no prints on the window latches either. Keys everywhere, but nothing on the ring he carried. Couldn't find the ring." "Neighbors?" Wallace asked. "Said they heard the TV for a while, then the fan, then nothing. Lady downstairs thought she heard a man talking around 11, but she says a lot of things." "Time of death?" "Ballpark between 10 and midnight. The bag does the trick fast if you sit calm, if not slower. No defensive wounds." "You're thinking it," Wallace said, "or just trying not to?" The tech looked up. "If it's a suicide, it's a dramatic one." Wallace stepped across the keys, careful as if they might stab. Each one felt like a little accusation under his soul. Keys meant doors, doors meant choices. He crouched in front of Dwyer and watched a fly reconnoiter the plastic. The man had shaved that morning ragged shadow where the razor missed a valley under his jaw. Right ring finger dented white where a band used to sit. He wore clean socks. He'd dressed for company that didn't come. The fan clicked. The envelopes fluttered, one corner stamped in red with an attorney's return address. Wallace caught the briefest flicker of himself in the dresser mirror-damp tie, tired eyes Baltimore jaundiced behind him. The city had that mid-90s flavor of old rot and new polish, smokers hunched in doorways, cranes pecking at harbor air, 1,000 little hustles. A uniformed officer appeared in the hall with a notebook. "Sir, the tenant who called it in's ready if you want her statement. Says she heard something 2 nights ago, arguing." "What kind of arguing?" Says it sounded like the landlord arguing with himself. Then again, the cop lifted a shoulder that meant unreliable narrator. "Says a lot of things." Wallace nodded. He didn't have the town's patience for stories tonight. He had the locked door, the missing ring, the 42 keys. He had a man who kept other people's doors in his pocket and was now, definitively, not leaving this room. "Bag him," Wallace said, standing. "Photograph every key and tag them individually. I want a map. I want a list of every Dwyer property and who lives there. And—" He chewed the inside of his cheek, irritated at the thought before it formed. Pull the cold case board for this district. Anything with tenants, anything with fires, anything with disappearances. Humor me. The tech gave a weary thumbs up that said, "You're the captain." Miles Harrington was in New York, reading the sports page he never cared about, because sometimes exhaustion only agrees to meet you halfway. The apartment had the tidy anonymity of a place that belongs to someone who comes home too late to notice it. On the table lay a deck of photographs he didn't look at anymore. A brick wall, a window sash, a narrow hallway with a rug that raised a rash on his memory. Queens, 3 apartments, 3 women, 1 landlord. It had ended inside a crawl space with damp breath and a rusty flashlight rolling a circle on the plaster, as if blessing the place. He'd filed the case, and then he'd boxed it, and then he pretended he'd solved it into stillness. The phone rang the old ugly way, metal on nerves. He let it ring 3 times so the caller would know he had a life. Then he answered. Harrington. Wallace. The name cut through 10 years of distance and a cloud of cigarette smoke that existed only in his head. Baltimore. Academy days. A face that always looked like it had just realized the punchline wasn't funny. To what? Miles said. Do I owe the pleasure? Wallace exhaled like he'd been holding it since '87. Got a body, landlord, locked room, keys everywhere like he tried to conjure somebody. Smells like a setup. Smells like something I don't want to be on the evening news. Miles stood, the stool legs scraping across the kitchen tile. It was January cold that tunneled in and hunkered under your shirt. He looked at the photographs he didn't look at. You got homicide stacked with new faces, he said. What do you need me for? Because you've seen this. That what you've got is a landlord does not make it my case. It's the manner, Wallace said, softer. The staging. We found a bag. We found no ring on a man who wore one. We found 42 keys that don't match the one thing I need, which is how the hell anyone got in or out. And, he paused, and Miles could feel him choose the next words like stepping stones. I remember Queens. I remember you walking me through it over beers like you were giving a sermon you never wanted to write. Miles pinched the bridge of his nose, the headache he nurtured when the past wanted to play fetch. You think it's connected? I think the pattern is the kind that pretends it's a coincidence. And I also think, if I don't call you and this turns into 3 more bodies, I'll have to live with your voice in my head for the rest of my life saying, told you so. I already got one of those. Don't need 2. Flattery, Miles said. He found his coat on the back of a chair, his travel bag already half-packed with the compulsions of his job, a notepad stiff with old water stains, a pen that wrote like it was scratching its own name into the world. Who's the Vic? Frank Dwyer. Slumlord if you ask the tenants, saint if you ask his little fan club. Has 30-odd keys to 30-odd lives, and now they're scattered around him like confetti. I've got a neighbor says she heard him arguing with someone 2 nights ago. I've got another swears he only argued with himself. I've got a ledger I haven't found yet but can smell somewhere in that house. Miles zipped the bag. He thought about the crawl space again and the way your body knows when there's another breathing thing sharing the dark with you. He thought about women telling stories no one wrote down because they didn't end in a gunshot. You want me quiet or loud? He asked. Quiet. I don't need the paper printing NYPD to the rescue. I need a mind that doesn't owe anyone a favor here. All right, Miles said. He flicked the light, watched the room go flat, and then disappear. Text me the address. I'll be down by morning. Harrington! Bring whatever you used last time to see in the dark. The line clicked, leaving the hum of a city that never learned to sleep without noise. Miles slid the photographs back into their box and tucked the box back into the closet behind the winter coats. He locked the apartment door and then immediately unlocked it, then locked it again, a ritual that had replaced prayer. Outside the street was a thin blade of January. He walked it anyway, feeling the night press in with that unkind intimacy he understood too well. Somewhere to the south a man lay amid a constellation of keys, and every door those keys belonged to was a mouth waiting to tell him a different lie. He hailed a cab. The driver had a cassette playing low, Stevie Wonder crooning about staying gold. Miles leaned his head back and let the words skim off him. In Baltimore, a dead landlord sat with his secrets arranged around him like offerings. In New York, a detective who specialized in other people's locked rooms stared through glass that reflected his own. The past had a way of finding the right key. It almost always did. Chapter 2, Out-of-State Detective. Baltimore looked hungover. Miles stepped off the Amtrak at Penn Station into air that smelled like gasoline and fried grease, the kind of mix that never quite lifts from an old city. Cabs jostled at the curb, drivers leaning out with offers. A man in a parka muttered obscenities at a ticket machine. It was January in the mid-90s, and the city wore its grit like an inherited suit ill-fitting, but too familiar to throw away. Captain Wallace was waiting in a government sedan that hadn't been washed since summer. He waved through the windshield, his meaty hand leaving a streak on the foggy glass. "Always a pleasure," Miles said, sliding into the passenger seat. "So you'll change your tune when you see the circus I've got." Wallace's tie was already askew, his shirt cuffs grey at the edges. He drove like the steering wheel owed him money, weaving through traffic with a horn tap that doubled as punctuation. "Tell me again why you dragged me down here," Miles said. Wallace sniffed. "Because I'm too old to pretend I've got this under control, and because you've seen this flavor of weird before. Your Queen's landlord case, it's not the same, but it rhymes." Miles adjusted his hat brim against the low winter glare. "And what's the official line?" "Officially? Accidental death, maybe suicide. Plastic bag, locked room, neat, easy, I can sell that if I have to. Unofficially," he let out a humorless laugh. "Unofficially, I've got 42 goddamn keys scattered like breadcrumbs, a missing wedding band, and tenants who can't agree if Dwyer was Mr. Rogers or a snake in a cardigan." They drove east into a stretch of blocky row houses, each identical in its ware brick fronts with sagging porches, iron railings tattooed with rust. A pair of kids lobbed snowballs across the street, the thwack of ice on car doors sharp as gunfire. Miles nodded slowly, eyes on the row of taped-off houses, the brick fronts all lined like teeth. "Yeah," he said. "This isn't just a dead landlord. It's a lockbox. Someone scattered the keys so we'd know there are more doors. The question is—" He adjusted his hat brim, the wind clawing at his coat. "Who wanted us to open them?" The house was cordoned with yellow tape, a cruiser idling at the curb. Miles stepped inside and the air hit him. Sour, stale, faint trace of bleach that someone had already tried to use like perfume. The floor still bore its constellation of keys, each tagged in neat evidence bags now. The body was gone, but its outline lingered in the air the way music does after someone shuts the radio off. "Walk me through," Miles said. The lead detective, a younger man with thinning hair named Keating, recited it like homework. Victim: Frank Dwyer, 48, landlord of 36 units, found by a tenant who hadn't seen him in 2 days. Cause of death: asphyxiation, plastic bag, locked room, no forced entry. Windows sealed, 42 keys recovered. None correspond to the lock on the door where he died. No wedding ring on the body, no wallet. Miles crouched to eye the doorframe. The paint was chipped near the bolt, but not fresh. He touched the jamb, then the sill. Clean. Too clean. "You dust?" "Came up with Dwyer's prints, nobody else's," Keating said. "Gloves, maybe. Or someone who knew how to wipe it down." Miles studied the room. The dresser had 3 shirts folded military tight, but the top drawer yawned open as if left mid-decision. A stack of envelopes leaned in the corner, each stamped with the same attorney's office. He slipped one open with a gloved finger. Overdue notices, demands. Dwyer owed money. Wallace leaned in the doorway, chewing on a toothpick he didn't remember putting in his mouth. "Landlord with cash flow problems. Not shocking. Half the city's in debt to somebody." Miles knelt closer to the floor. A thin groove ran in an arc near the bed frame. He pressed a finger into it. Smooth. Not recent. Maybe a trunk dragged across the wood again and again. He straightened. "You said 42 keys. What kind?" Keating gestured to an evidence table. Miles sifted through bag after bag, apartment keys, mailbox keys, old skeleton keys yellowed with rust. Some were engraved with initials, others had masking tape with faded Sharpie scrawls. "Not all from his properties," Keating admitted. "Couple don't match anything in his records. We're still running them." Miles paused at one long brass key with a heart-shaped bow. Old hand-cut. Not the sort of thing a modern landlord would carry. "How you test for prints on these?" "Wiped clean," Keating said. "Every last one." Miles set it down carefully. The tenant who found the body, a woman in her 30s, tired eyes, hair pulled into a loose scarf, sat on the couch downstairs with a styrofoam cup of coffee. She looked up as Miles entered. "You the one from New York?" she asked. "Yeah," Miles said. He stayed standing. "Tell me what you heard." She shifted, eyes on the cup. "2 nights before he died, I heard voices upstairs. Thought maybe he had the TV too loud, but then I heard him shout, like he was arguing with someone. Except when I went closer, it sounded like just him, like he was, answering himself." "You ever know him to have visitors?" She laughed without humor. "Only when he wanted something, rent, a favor. He liked to remind you he had the keys." She set the cup down, hands trembling slightly. "Sometimes I'd wake up and swear I heard someone in my kitchen. Once, my little girl swore she saw him standing in her doorway." Miles didn't write it down. He just let it hang in the air because silence sometimes filled in more than ink. When he rejoined Wallace outside, the captain was lighting a cigarette against the wind. "You see what I mean," Wallace said. Miles nodded slowly, eyes on the row of taped-off houses, the brick fronts all lined like teeth. "Yeah," he said. "This isn't just a dead landlord. It's a lockbox. Someone scattered the keys so we'd know there are more doors. The question is—" He adjusted his hat brim, the wind clawing at his coat. "Who wanted us to open them?" Chapter 3. The Tenants. The city didn't trust the cold. Baltimore's January had teeth, but not the kind that lasted. The ice on the sidewalks already wept into grey slush by noon. Miles followed Wallace up the narrow stairwell of Dwyer's building, past plaster cracked like a road map. Each landing smelled like its owner. Boiled cabbage, menthol cigarettes, cat piss. The lives stacked on top of one another, each one holding the ceiling of the next. The first knock brought a woman in a housecoat with a toddler pressed against her hip. Clara Johnson, 32, the tenant who'd found the body. She had the eyes of someone used to repeating herself to people who didn't listen. "You already got my statement," she said. "You'll forgive me for asking again," Miles said. He kept his voice low, calm. "Details change when you tell them twice." She shifted the boy higher on her hip. "Details don't change. Man was a creep. Liked to remind us all he had keys. Once came in when I was in the shower, said he was checking the pipes. I screamed until he backed out, laughing." "That funny enough for you?" Miles studied her. "You ever tell anyone?" "Cops, please. A landlord gets a slap on the wrist and you get a notice to vacate. My kid needs a roof." Her voice tightened. "You know what he said once? Said he owned more than just the bricks. Said he owned the people who couldn't afford better." Wallace coughed behind Miles, a sound like gravel moving. Miles nodded his thanks and moved on. The next door belonged to Tommy and Sheila Crane, brother and sister who looked half-wrecked already, though neither could be more than mid-30s. Their apartment reeked of sweet smoke and something sharper ammonia, or fear. "So he was all right by us," Tommy said, scratching at his neck. "Let us slide on rent when things got tight. Even gave me work patching drywall in his other places." Sheila gave a short bark of a laugh. "Yeah, because he liked having you on a leash, same as the rest of us." She leaned toward Miles. "You know he had a type. Always the women alone. Dropped off groceries like he was the Good Samaritan. Then you catch him looking too long, the kind of look that sticks." Tommy glared at her, eyes rimmed red. "Don't start, Sheila. He put food on the table. He put fear in the walls." They fell silent, and the silence told Miles more than the words. Two narratives, one of gratitude, one of violation. Both true, maybe. Both ugly. The last door on the top floor belonged to Evelyn Price, a widow with silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Her living room was immaculate, not a thread out of place, and smelled faintly of lavender polish. "Frank was kind to me," she said, hands folded in her lap. "Checked in after Harold passed, carried my groceries, fixed the heater without me asking." Her voice wavered delicately, as if rehearsed. "I can't imagine who would harm him." "You never had trouble with him coming into your unit uninvited?" Miles asked. Her eyes sharpened just for a flicker, before softening again. "No, Frank respected me." She offered a tight smile. "Not everyone sees monsters in the shadows, Detective." Miles stood, thanked her, and walked out with Wallace. On the stairwell, Wallace muttered, "She's either blind or lying." "Maybe both," Miles said. "But she believes it. That's what makes it useful." Back outside, Miles leaned against the cruiser, flipping open his notebook. 3 tenants, 3 versions of Frank Dwyer. Predator, savior, saint. He tapped the pen against the page. "Keys," he said. "You find out where they all go?" "Half match his properties. Other half don't. Some are decades old. Couple don't open anything we've tried." Miles thought of Clara's story Dwyer in the shower, laughing, of Sheila's bitter laugh, of Evelyn's saintly insistence. People like Dwyer collected more than rent. They collected lives, secrets, debts, and someone had decided to cash him out. Wallace lit another cigarette. "So what's your gut?" Miles watched the smoke curl. "My gut says Dwyer didn't die because he was a landlord. He died because of what he kept behind other people's doors, and whoever killed him wanted us to know it." Wallace raised a brow. "You think the keys were staged?" "I think they're an invitation," Miles said. "Question is to what?" The wind bit through his coat, and for a moment the row houses seemed to lean in, listening. Chapter 4. Keys to Nowhere. The evidence room at Baltimore PD smelled like paper that had outlived its usefulness. Rows of metal shelves sagged under boxes, stamped with faded case numbers. Wallace led Miles past them until they reached a folding table laid out like a pawn shop gone wrong. 42 bagged keys, each tagged with property addresses or the word unknown. Keating, the thin-haired detective from the scene, shuffled a stack of forms. "We've run them against every address Dwyer owned. 23 match his properties, 6 belong to mailboxes, 2 to cars he used to own." He hesitated. "The rest. Nothing. Doesn't fit his portfolio." Miles picked up one bag. Inside, a skeleton key, long and slender, the kind that belonged to doors built before electricity. Another bore a brass tag etched with the number 18. Another had tape with the faded initials LC. "You log the unknowns with property records." "Already checked. No hits, not rentals, not city-owned, not condemned." Wallace crossed his arms. So either the guy was a collector, or he was holding onto doors that didn't belong to him. Miles lined the bags side by side, arranging them into clusters. Dwyer wasn't a collector. He was a landlord. Keys were currency. Access. Leverage. He tapped one bag labeled Unknown, Match Pending. "What's this one?" Keating squinted. "Opens nothing, old style, maybe late 60s. "Pull unsolved," Miles said. "Disappearances, break-ins, overdoses, any case where entry was a question mark." Wallace frowned. "You think he's tied to old murders?" "I think people like him don't change their habits. If he had doors he wasn't supposed to, he used them." By afternoon, the cold caseboard was wheeled into the squad room. The names stared out in grainy black-and-white photos, women who vanished, women who were found dead with nothing stolen. Miles moved between them like he was reading a constellation. One case caught him. Leah Carter, 22, disappeared 1988. Her apartment had no signs of forced entry. The only odd detail, her lock was brand new, changed by the landlord the week before. He looked at the key tagged LC and felt his stomach shift. Another case. Denise Holloway, 29, overdose 1990. Neighbors insisted she'd been clean for 2 years. Police found no forced entry, no evidence of tampering. Miles picked up a key with a brass head engraved 18. Denise had lived in Unit 18. Wallace saw his face change. "You're telling me we've been sitting on this guy for years?" Miles shook his head. "Not sitting, missing. Everyone saw him as background noise, landlord with a ring of keys. You don't question it, until you're the one behind the door." That evening, Miles walked the neighborhood. The row houses leaned against one another like tired drunks. He tried the brass-tagged key at one of Dwyer's buildings. It didn't fit the front door. He circled back to a side alley, past trash cans and graffiti. The key slid into a basement lock smooth as butter. The door creaked open into darkness that smelled of damp earth and mold. He found a bare bulb on a pull chain. The light snapped on, buzzing. The basement was empty except for a single chair and a stack of milk crates. On top, a Polaroid curled with age. A young woman seated in the same chair, her eyes glassy, mouth slack. Miles turned it over. In Dwyer's cramped handwriting, returned key. Wallace's face went pale when Miles handed him the photo. Jesus. Dwyer wasn't just collecting rents, Miles said. He was collecting lives, and someone decided to stop him. Wallace rubbed his temple. "So our Vic's a predator? You saying his killer was one of the tenants?" Miles slid the photo back into the envelope. "Could be. Could also be someone who's been carrying this secret for years. Someone who wanted us to see it." He glanced back at the table of bagged keys. "This isn't about one murder, Wallace. This is a map, and we haven't finished reading it." The captain exhaled smoke into the stale air. "Christ, we're not hunting a killer. We're digging up a graveyard." Miles didn't disagree. Chapter 5, The Journal. The ledger was hidden, where only a man who trusted no one would put it, underneath the false bottom of a filing cabinet in Dwyer's cluttered office. It wasn't much to look at. A cheap composition notebook with marbled black and white cover, the corners swollen from damp, the spine taped twice over with electrician's tape. Miles found it by accident. He'd been pulling old invoices and repair slips, the kind of paperwork landlords stockpile as proof they once fixed a leaky faucet, when his knuckles rapped against hollow metal. He pried at the thin sheet with his pocket knife until it came loose with a squeal. The book slid out with a soft thud, like something exhaling relief at being found. He flipped it open and felt the air tighten. Inside, the pages were lined with neat, deliberate handwriting. Each entry no more than a date, an address, 2 or 3 initials, and sometimes a note. 12 was 0488, 1427E. Preston, LEC, said no. 52290, 224, Hollins St. D.H., didn't answer. Flight 1192, 18 Mulberry, returned key. There were dozens of entries, spanning nearly 15 years. Some of the initials matched the women on the cold case board. Others matched no one yet. Wallace leaned over Miles's shoulder. His cigarette stank of cheap tobacco, the smoke curling into the small office like a nervous ghost. Jesus Christ, he kept records. Miles nodded, turning the pages carefully. Not just records, a ritual. He tapped a page near the middle. EP, returned key. Evelyn Price, Wallace muttered. The widow upstairs. He circled it twice. Miles studied the double loops of ink, the way the pen had pressed hard enough to dent the page beneath. Means something. Maybe she gave the key back. Maybe she refused him. Either way, she mattered. They took the ledger back to the precinct, spread photocopies across the war table in the squad room. Keating pinned them up next to the cold case photos. The effect was nauseating. Women's faces beside cryptic notes, the shorthand of a man who thought of people as possessions. Not all initials match, Keating said. Some of these could be men, some could be kids. We don't know yet. Miles tapped the table. Look at the verbs. Said no, didn't answer, returned key. He wasn't describing repairs, he was describing encounters. He offered something. They refused. They disappeared. Wallace blew out smoke. So we've got ourselves a serial predator, a slumlord who thought his tenants were his harem, and now he's dead in a locked room. Miles rubbed his temple. And someone wanted us to find this. That's the part that matters. The killer didn't take the ledger. They left it behind like an exhibit. They wanted us to read his crimes. That night, Miles walked back to Dwyer's building. The tenants avoided his eyes as he passed, retreating into doorways and kitchens. The stairwell smelled of fried onions and bleach. Evelyn Price's door was cracked, her living room lamp glowing warm against the cold hall. She let him in with a polite smile, her hands folded the same way as before. "So I won't take much of your time," Miles said. He set the photocopied page on her coffee table, the one marked EP, returned key. Her eyes darted to it, then away. "I don't know what that is. You ever give him a key back?" Her throat worked as she swallowed. "Yes, once, years ago. He insisted on having a spare to my apartment. Said it was for emergencies. I told him I didn't feel comfortable. He looked at me like I'd insulted him, but I gave it back." She smoothed her skirt, fingers trembling. "I didn't see him the same way after that." Miles leaned forward. "Did he ever come back?" She closed her eyes. "Once. He stood in my doorway without knocking. I told him to leave. He laughed. Said he just wanted to make sure I was all right. I locked the door behind him and put a chair under the knob." "Did you ever tell anyone?" She shook her head. Who would believe me? He owned the locks. Back at his hotel, Miles laid the photocopies across the bedspread, tracing connections with a pen. Dwyer had been building a private archive of refusal. Each woman who rejected him became an entry. Some survived, others vanished. But something nagged. Not all entries ended in tragedy. Some were crossed out or marked returned key. Why keep those? Unless the act of refusal itself was what thrilled him. Collecting resistance, just as much as submission. The killer had scattered the keys, left the ledger, staged the body. They hadn't silenced Dwyer's crimes, they'd amplified them. Miles lit a cigarette and cracked the window. Outside, the city pulsed with neon and fog, alive with voices that didn't care what he uncovered. He thought of Clara Johnson, clutching her child, of Sheila Crane, bitter and broken, of Evelyn Price, circling her shame in silence. Someone in that building had lived with Dwyer's shadow for too long. Someone had finally turned the lock back on him. The question was, who and what did they want the rest of the world to see? Chapter 6, Ghosts in the Houses. The addresses in the ledger weren't just Baltimore. Some were blocks away from Dwyer's known properties, but others stretched into neighborhoods he never had business in. Wallace pulled the records anyway, grumbling as if every sheet of paper was a personal insult. By late morning, Miles and Keating were walking through a two-story on Preston Street. The key with the faded LC tag fit the front door with a metallic sigh. The place had been gutted years ago, its insides torn down to studs. Graffiti layered the walls in black loops, beer cans collapsed in corners. "Leah Carter," Miles said quietly, running a hand along the frame. "Disappeared in '88. Her landlord was Dwyer's cousin. He'd inherited the keys when the cousin skipped town." Keating flipped his notebook. "She was last seen coming home from a diner shift. No forced entry, no robbery. They wrote her off as a runaway after a year." Miles crouched near the kitchen. The floor still bore dark stains in the grooves between tiles. He touched one, the sticky residue long since absorbed into the house itself. Runaways don't leave blood in kitchens. The second stop was Hollins Street, a row house with a for sale sign tilting like it had given up. The brass key labeled 18 turned smoothly in the basement door. The air inside was stale, damp, full of rot. Miles pulled the chain on a dangling bulb. The light buzzed on, revealing another chair in the center of the basement, this one rusting at the joints. "Christ," Keating whispered. On the far wall, words were scratched into the plaster. "Said no." Miles felt his stomach turn. Dwyer hadn't just written his ledger, he'd carved it into the world. Wallace's voice echoed down the stairwell. "We can't tie this to him yet. This could be anyone." "Anyone with 42 keys?" Miles asked. He brushed dust off the lettering. He made trophies out of rejection. If she refused him, he made sure the house remembered it. By dusk, Miles had walked through 3 more properties. Each one carried echoes, scuff marks, stains, scratches. Not enough forensics left to prosecute, but enough to paint a picture. At the last stop, an abandoned duplex, a neighbor leaned out from her porch as Miles left. She was elderly, eyes sharp as pins. "You looking into Frank Dwyer?" she asked. Miles paused. "Yes, ma'am." She spat into the dirt. "Good riddance. Man was poison. Used to stand across the street and just watch like he was cataloguing people. My niece lived in his place. Vanished in 91. They said she ran away. She never ran from anything. He killed her. I knew it then." Her voice cracked, but her eyes didn't. Back at the precinct, Wallace slammed his fist against the cold caseboard. Photos, addresses, initials, notes, all lines converging into Dwyer's ugly orbit. "We've got enough to call him a predator," Wallace said. "We can paint him as a serial offender, tie him to 6 disappearances. But it doesn't get us closer to who killed him." Miles leaned against the table, cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling around the photographs. "Maybe it does. Whoever killed him knew about this ledger. They scattered the keys so we'd dig up these ghosts. That's not just vengeance. That's messaging." "Are you saying we've got a crusader on our hands?" Miles exhaled. "Someone who wanted the city to see Dwyer for what he was. The question is, did they kill him to protect themselves or to avenge someone else?" That night, Miles walked the hall of Dwyer's building again. The tenants' doors were closed tight, locks double-bolted. Clara Johnson cracked hers an inch when she saw him. "You find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Not yet," Miles said. She hesitated. "You should stop looking. Some doors don't need to be opened." The door clicked shut. Miles stood in the dim hall, the single bulb humming above him. Behind every door was a story. Some were half told, some were erased, some were buried, and the man who owned the keys to them all was finally silent. But silence had a way of inviting voices back. Chapter 7. The Tenant's Story. Clara Johnson opened her door wider this time, though her eyes darted up and down the hall like she expected Dwyer to materialize, keys jangling, that awful laugh filling the stairwell. She motioned Miles inside quickly, shutting the door with a thud and sliding 2 locks home. The apartment was cramped, a child's toys stacked in a corner, dishes drying on a towel by the sink. The radiator hissed like an angry cat. Her little boy was asleep on the couch, thumb in his mouth, cartoon static flickering across the screen. "I shouldn't even be talking to you," Clara whispered. "If the other tenants find out—" "I'm not here to stir trouble," Miles said. He kept his voice low, steady. "But you saw something, more than you told the uniforms." Her hands twisted the edge of her sweater. She sat, but her legs bounced with restless energy. "He came by 2 nights before he died, late after midnight. I heard him on the stairs. I thought maybe he was drunk. Then—" She swallowed, glanced toward her son. "He stopped at my door. I heard the key turn. I keep my own bolt extra. He didn't get in. He tried, though. Stood there for 5 minutes, just testing." Miles leaned forward. "Did you confront him?" "I froze. I didn't want him knowing I was awake. Then I heard him go upstairs. That's when I heard the arguing." "Arguing with who?" "That's the thing." Her voice broke into a whisper. It sounded like no one. He was shouting, then answering himself. But the words he kept saying, "I own you. You don't say no." Over and over. Miles wrote it down. "And the night he died." Her eyes welled. "I heard something. Heavy thumps, like furniture scraping, then silence. I peeked out and saw someone leaving his unit." Miles's pen stilled. "Who?" She clenched her jaw, every muscle in her face resisting. "I don't know. It was dark, a figure quick down the stairs. I thought maybe it was him at first, but it wasn't." "Man or woman?" "Small. Could have been either." She gripped the sweater tighter. "But they were carrying something, like a bag or a book. Hugged it to their chest." Miles thought of the ledger, the way it had been hidden but not destroyed. Someone had handled it before him. Back at the precinct, Miles laid the account before Wallace. The captain pinched the bridge of his nose. So she saw someone. Could be anyone. Half the block's got access to this place. Not anyone, Miles said. Someone who knew where he kept the ledger. Someone who wanted it seen. Wallace grunted. Or someone trying to set us chasing ghosts. Miles didn't answer. He replayed Clara's description, small, carrying something. Evelyn Price's narrow frame fit that image, but so did Sheila Crane's wiry shape. Later, Miles knocked on Sheila's door. She opened it with a cigarette already lit, smoke curling into his face. Her brother sat hunched on the couch, nodding off, an empty bottle between his knees. "What now?" she asked. "Where were you the night Dwyer died?" She snorted. "Here, like always. Ask my brother. He doesn't move except to score." Tommy stirred, blinking. "She was here." His voice was sluggish. "Did Dwyer ever threaten you?" Miles pressed. Her eyes hardened. "He didn't have to. He'd just show up, watching, like he was waiting for me to slip." She jabbed her cigarette at the air. "One time he told me I'd owed him a favor since the day he let us move in. You know what that means." She took a long drag, exhaled bitter smoke. "I hated him, but I didn't kill him, Detective. Men like him rot on their own." Her words were sharp, but the way her eyes flickered sideways at Tommy told Miles something else. There were secrets here, too. That night in his motel room, Miles reread the ledger under the yellow lamp. He circled the entries tied to known cases, double-lined the ones marked with initials that matched current tenants. Fessie Duke didn't answer. CJ said no. EP, returned key. All three women in the building. All three in his sights. He lit a cigarette, let the smoke drift toward the ceiling. Dwyer's killer hadn't come from nowhere. They'd stepped straight out of the shadows he cast over his tenants. Each one had motive. Each one had fear. Each one had rage. But only one had the nerve to turn the keys against him. Miles closed the notebook, the weight of it heavier than the smoke in his lungs. The house still held ghosts, and one of them was lying. Chapter 8. Cracks in the Case. The autopsy came in just after dawn. The report slapped onto Wallace's desk with the dampness of coffee rings, already smudging the corner. Miles read it slowly, each line narrowing the margins of possibility. Cause of death: suffocation by plastic obstruction. Time of death between 10:45 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. Notable findings: ligature marks on the wrists, faint bruising on the jaw. Not consistent with self-inflicted asphyxiation. Not suicide, Miles said, sliding the folder back. Means we've got a homicide. Wallace tapped his cigarette into an overflowing tray. Which means I've got a neighborhood ready to riot and a press that wants blood. Miles pointed at the bruising detail. He was restrained first. Someone tied him, bagged him, then sat him up like he'd done it himself. Whoever it was had control, time, and the nerve to scatter keys after. Keating appeared in the doorway holding a plastic evidence bag. Inside, a single fingerprint card. Prints from one of the brass keys matched a tenant, Evelyn Price. Wallace swore under his breath. The widow, the one who swore he was a saint. Miles frowned. Fingerprints don't mean she killed him. She admitted he had her spare key once. Still makes her look good for it, Wallace said. We put her in a box, lean hard, maybe she cracks. But Miles's gut twisted. Evelyn's grief had been polished, yes, maybe rehearsed, but she didn't have the sharpness he'd expect of someone who'd staged that crime scene. She had the look of someone still trapped by Dwyer's shadow, not someone who'd stepped out of it with violence. They brought her in anyway. Evelyn sat across from Miles in the interview room, hands folded so tightly her knuckles shone. The single overhead bulb turned her hair into a crown of dull silver. I told you, she whispered. Frank was kind to me. Miles slid the photocopy of the ledger toward her. EP returned key. She flinched as though struck. He kept track of you, Miles said. He wrote it down. He circled it twice. Why? I don't know. Her eyes glistened. Maybe because I told him no, he wanted a spare. I gave it back. I thought that was the end of it. Did you ever see him again after that? Her lips trembled. He stood outside my door sometimes, just Stood there, I could see his shadow under the frame. I thought if I didn't move, he'd go away. Miles leaned closer. Where were you the night he died? At home, alone, I was reading. Her voice cracked. You think I killed him? Wallace cut in from the corner. Your prints on his key say otherwise. She shook her head violently. I never went back up there. I wanted nothing from him. Her voice rose to a shriek that startled even Wallace. Then she sagged, sobbing into her folded hands. Miles studied her carefully. The outburst didn't feel staged. It felt like years of swallowed fear finally spilling over. Back in the hall, Wallace muttered, She's hiding something. Nobody cries like that unless they're guilty. Or unless they're terrified, Miles said. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the stale precinct air. He thought of Clara's whisper about a small figure leaving Dwyer's unit with something clutched to their chest. Evelyn fit that profile. So did Clara. So did Sheila. It was a triangle, each point sharp with motive. That night, Miles walked the block again. Snow flurries dusted the stoops, already turning grey from passing boots. He stopped at Clara's door, then thought better of it. Instead, he lingered in the alley behind the building. There, under the weak glow of a flickering street lamp, he noticed something he hadn't before. Drag marks in the slush, faint but deliberate, like someone had hauled a heavy bag from the back stairwell to the curb. The marks ended where the garbage bins lined up. He opened the nearest lid and winced at the sour stench. Nothing but trash, but when he tipped the bin slightly, he saw it. A length of thin cord, frayed at the ends, the kind that could bind wrists. Someone had been sloppy, or someone had wanted it found. Miles tucked the cord into an evidence bag, his mind already mapping the next move. Back in his motel room, he laid out the journal photocopies, the photos of the crime scene, the fingerprint match, and the cord. He drew lines between them, circling names. Clara Johnson, Sheila Crane, Evelyn Price. 3 women, 3 stories. Dwyer had tried to own them all. Now one of them owned his death. But the cracks were widening. The ledger was too neat, the keys too carefully placed, and that cord in the trash too obvious. Someone wasn't just killing to silence Dwyer. Someone was orchestrating a narrative, and Miles Harrington knew better than anyone. When the story looks too perfect, that's when you start pulling at the seams. Chapter 9. The Trap. The snow had turned to a grey paste by morning, the sidewalk slick with it. Miles nursed burnt coffee in a styrofoam cup as Wallace dropped another file on the diner table. The smell of bacon and grease couldn't cover the sour tang of what they were looking at. Evelyn Price, Wallace said, tapping the manila folder. Her husband died in a fire back in '91, one of Dwyer's row houses. Fire marshal called it faulty wiring. But guess who handled the insurance claim? Dwyer himself. Guess who pocketed the payout as executor of the estate? Miles flipped the page. Evelyn's name was on every form, her signature small and precise. So she lost her husband, her home, and owed her landlord a favor he never let her forget. Looks like motive to me, Wallace said. Husband dies on Dwyer's watch. Years later, she kills him, nice and clean. Too clean, Miles muttered. He pushed the file aside. Evelyn fit the narrative too well. Her grief was rehearsed, her fingerprints on the key, a past fire that tied her to Dwyer's corruption, a prosecutor's dream, which meant someone wanted her framed. That night, Miles returned to Dwyer's office. The ledger still haunted him, the way some entries were circled, the way others ended abruptly. He laid it open under the lamp. EP returned key. STB didn't answer. CJ said no. All 3 still alive. All 3 in the same building. Why would Dwyer leave them alive while others vanished? Why record their refusals if not to savor them? Unless the ledger wasn't his alone. Miles ran a finger over the ink. Some entries were heavier, the pen biting deep into the page. Others were lighter, neater, almost delicate. Different hands. 2 people wrote this, Miles whispered. He snapped the book shut. The next day he set the trap. He asked Wallace to leak a false detail that police had matched DNA from the cord in the trash to Evelyn Price. They released just enough for word to seep through the building walls. Then Miles waited in his car across the street, the engine idling, cigarette smoke fogging the glass. By midnight, a shadow slipped out of the building. Not Evelyn Clara Johnson. She clutched something tight to her chest, scanning the street before hurrying down the block. Miles followed on foot, quiet as the snow falling again. Clara ducked into the basement of a condemned row house. The door creaked shut. Miles eased it open minutes later. The basement stank of mold. Clara stood in the center, a candle flickering beside her. In her hands was the ledger, open, pages trembling. She looked up at him, eyes wild. "I had to," she whispered. "He was going to hurt my little girl. I found this book, and I knew if I didn't stop him, he'd keep coming." "Clara," Miles said carefully, stepping closer, "put the book down." Her voice hardened. "Don't you see? He kept track of us, every one of us, the ones who said no, the ones who disappeared. I couldn't let my daughter be another entry. So I killed him. I tied him. I bagged him. And then I gave you the map." She jabbed a finger at the ledger. "I wanted you to see. I wanted everyone to see." Miles's chest tightened. It wasn't rage in her eyes, it was resolve. The kind that burned colder than grief. "You staged it," he said softly. "You scattered the keys. You wanted the city to dig up his past." Her chin lifted. "Better than burying it again." Back at the precinct, Wallace slammed his fist against the table. "So that's it? The single mother? She admits it, and we cuff her, and that's the end." Miles didn't answer right away. He looked at the ledger, its pages open under the harsh fluorescent lights. 2 handwritings, 2 sets of secrets. "She killed him," Miles said finally. "But someone helped keep his ledger alive. Someone else wrote in this book. And until I know who, none of us should be sleeping easy." Wallace stared at him, uneasy. Miles lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward. "The trap worked, but I think we caught only half the story." Chapter 10. The Killer Revealed. The confession was neat. Too neat. Clara Johnson signed it with shaking hands, her daughter waiting in child services, Wallace triumphant with a fresh cigar. The press would eat it whole. The single mother, the predator landlord, justice in its rawest form. But Miles didn't light his own cigarette. He just stared at the ledger. 2 handwritings, 2 storytellers. Clara's words rang true. She killed Dwyer to protect her daughter. But who wrote the other entries? Who had been chronicling victims years before Clara ever moved into the building? He sat in the squad room long after midnight, spreading the photocopies across the table again. The heavier scrawl belonged to Dwyer, angry, jagged. But the neat, deliberate script? That had started years later. Entries about Clara, Sheila, Evelyn. Someone else had picked up the pen. He went back to the building at dawn. The hall was quiet, pipes rattling like bones in the walls. He knocked on Evelyn Price's door. She answered in her robe, eyes puffy from sleeplessness. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, "for catching her. I'll be able to breathe again." Miles studied her, the calm veneer, too calm for someone supposedly terrified. He stepped inside, uninvited. The apartment smelled of polish and lavender as before. But on the desk in the corner lay a fountain pen, its nib stained black. Beside it, a stack of notepaper with letters etched in the same delicate script he'd seen in the ledger. "Nice pen," Miles said. Evelyn froze. "You knew about the ledger," he continued, "because you wrote in it. After Dwyer started circling you, you began keeping your own record. You knew which women he targeted, who said no, who survived. You made sure their names were written down, just as neat as your parlor." Her face paled. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand." Miles stepped closer. "Clara killed him, she told me. But the staging, the keys scattered, the way the ledger was left like bait, that was you. You wanted her to do it. Or someone, anyone. You'd been waiting for years for the right moment. And when she snapped, you cleaned it up into a message." Evelyn's lips trembled, but she didn't deny it. "I couldn't stop him," she whispered. But I could make sure no one forgot. They'd call those women runaways, addicts, liars. I wanted the truth written down. I wanted the city to know. You framed yourself with those fingerprints, Miles said. Deliberately sloppy, just enough to draw suspicion but not enough to hold. You made yourself the grieving widow, the survivor, and when Clara finally killed him, you played curator of his sins. Her eyes shone with tears, but there was steel beneath them. Would you rather he'd kept on? Another girl, another daughter. Tell me you wouldn't have done the same. Miles didn't answer. He just closed the ledger and slipped it into his coat. Back at the precinct, Wallace grumbled when Miles laid it all out. So what? We've got 2 guilty women. One killed him, the other staged it. Hell, Harrington, the jury won't know which way to look. They don't have to, Miles said. Clara confessed. She'll go away. Evelyn will keep her silence, but we'll know the truth. Dwyer didn't just die by one hand. He died by every locked door he ever owned. Wallace shook his head. You're a bastard, Harrington. Miles lit a cigarette, exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Takes one to know one. When he left Baltimore that evening, the snow had begun again, soft and soundless. From the train window, the row houses blurred together, a crooked spine against the horizon. Clara would sit in a cell, her daughter in the system. Evelyn would keep polishing her perfect apartment, ledger entries etched into her bones. And Frank Dwyer, landlord, predator, collector of keys, would rot beneath the ground he thought he owned. Miles leaned back, hat low, smoke curling into the stale air of the train car. He thought of all the doors in the world, each with a lock, each with a key, each with a story behind it. And he knew one thing for certain. Some doors never should have been opened. End of chapter and end of story. Please like and subscribe to support our channel. And to listen to more murder mysteries and investigative stories,